In part 2 of our tic-tac-toe video, we're going to enhance our program to allow multiple games played together as one match. At the end, the program will tell us which player won and how many games each player won. It also allows us to name our players, so instead of saying player 1 wins, it tells us the name of the player. So the first thing we need to do is add a new form, which I've already done here, but I'll show you how to do it. Over on our Solution Explorer, if it's not visible, you can view it by going to the View menu. We want to click on the name of our application. Mine's called TTT. Yours might be called something different. We want to right click, go to Add, and then go to Windows Form. Name it, Names, Startup, whatever, and click Add. We will then get a new form. On the form, we need a label for the title, 3 prompts, which are also labels. Remember, a prompt is a label that tells us what to type into a text box. We need 3 text boxes, and we need a Start button and a Quit button. Pause the video and add these objects to your new form. The names for these objects are LBL Player 1, LBL Player 2, TXT Player 1, TXT Player 2, LBL Games, TXT Games, BTN Start, and BTN Quit. Now the Quit button is incredibly easy to code. We simply double click the Quit button, and just like in VB, application.exit in the parentheses, and remember we need the semicolon. So that button was incredibly easy to code. One line, that quits our application. Now, the Start button, we need to pull in the values of the variables, or the values of the text boxes, I should say, into variables. So we're going to create some variables here: string player 1, player 2, and games temp. Remember, when we create an integer, we need to, from a text box, we have to convert it. So we're going to use a string to hold the value temporarily to convert it. Then we're going to create an integer called games. Now, player 1 simply equals txt player1.text. Player 2 equals txt player2.text. And games temp equals txt games.text. Now, in VB, you cannot put multiple coding statements on the same line. In C#, this is perfectly valid. As long as you have the semicolons, which you see I have here, this is perfectly valid code. So since these 3 commands are all doing the same thing, it makes the code more clear to put them on the same line. If that's confusing and you put them on multiple lines, that's fine too. Just for the sake of you being able to see all the code, since I've zoomed in, I put it on one line. Now for games, we need to convert to an integer. The conversion process works just as it did in VB. Exact same command. Convert.toInt32, then the name of the variable. Just like in VB, if we type Apple in games, the program will crash. So it would be smart to use a try-catch here. For the sake of time in this video, I'm not going to include that, but that's something you should include in your own video. If you need help with try-catch, be sure to ask your instructor for assistance. Okay, the next thing we need to do is we need to tell C# to start our program not using form 1, but using our names form. Now in VB, we could go to the properties of the program and pick the startup form. Doesn't work that way in C#. We have this other file called program.cs. If we open it, we see some very basic code. The line we're interested in is right here. Yours will say application.run parenthesis new form 1 open close parenthesis semicolon. We want to change it. where it says form 1, change it to the name of the new form you created. So now when this runs, you see the form that we just created pops up, not the form with the actual game on it. And when I click quit, everything closes. Pause the video and add this code here and change program.cs to open the appropriate form. Alright, the next thing we need to do is actually call form 1 so it'll open. Now we just can't type in open form 1. As you see here, we can't do that. It doesn't know what that is. Doesn't know what open is. So we have to do something else. We actually have to create an instance of form 1 and then initialize it. We're going to say form. It's like we're creating a variable, but we're referencing a class here. We're going to say form TTTGame equals new form 1, because that's what our form is named. So we now have a variable called TTTGame that contains form 1. We can now use methods of the form class, and one of those methods is the show method. So now we're going to show the form. Now we don't want the user to click back to this form, which would confuse the program, so we're going to hide this form. So in VB we said me. Well, notice me doesn't work. When I type me, I get measure item event args. Doesn't work. In C# it's this dot hide. So we're going to show form 1 hide form where we typed in the names. Okay, now we need to pass the values we created on this form to our other program. We just can't take values on this form and call them over on form 1. That won't work. We actually have to pass those values. So to pass the values, we just like in VB, we type the names of the variables. So we have player 1, player 2, and games. Now we're going to get an error saying ttt.form1 does not contain a constructor that takes 3 arguments. We're going to fix that. So we're going to go back over here to form1.cs and look at this right here. This is called the constructor. It's a method that runs when the form is first called, and all we're doing right now is initializing component. This sets the form ready for use and allows us to access the buttons, labels on that form. If we don't have this initialize component command and then try to access the button, it won't work. So this is automatically added when we create the form, but we're going to change it. Instead of using the default constructor, we're going to create our own. And we're going to pass in these variables. Unlike VB, you do not have to type by val in front of each value. By val is assumed. If you want to use a reference variable, you actually have to, if you want to pass by reference, you actually have to do something else, and we'll talk about that later. But for now, just know that you do not need to type in by val. I'm passing string 1, string player 1, string player 2, and int games by val. Now, I still can't just access the values. I've passed them into the constructor. I still need to get them in the program. So up here above the constructor, I'm going to declare some variables for this form. So string player 1, and I'll give it a default value here, string.empty. String player 2 equals string.empty, and int games equals 0. Now, I'm going to come down here, and I can't say player 1 equals player 1. It's going to say argument made to same variable, did you mean to assign something else? I did. I meant to assign this player 1, which tells it use the player 1 on this form that we've created here and assign it the value we passed in. So we have this dot player 2 equals player 2, and this dot games equals games. Now I could have called them something else, and that certainly would have worked. I just wanted to show you, reinforce that we use this instead of me when we're referencing the form itself. So I did it this way to show you again instances we use where we have to use this, which was me in VB. So we now have our constructor creating our values and then passing them to the program. So if I were to come down here and say messagebox.show player1 and run this program, I'll give player 1 John. I'll put some in here so it doesn't crash. I'll click the X and you see we now get John. If I take this line out and try again, John 3 start, click, notice we don't have a value for player 1. So these lines here we have to have for the program to operate. Pause the video and add this code now. Now that we have the values, we can continue. I'm going to get rid of this line here. We don't need it. Now, we don't need to change any code in our buttons. That code stays the same. Down here in the win condition, however, we do want to change some code. Instead of saying player 1 wins, we want it to say the player that actually won. So we're going to highlight all of this code all the way down to right here. We're going to use our handy dandy replace. Control H, player, and we're actually going to type the entire thing here. Player 1 wins. And we're going to change it to the name of our variable, player 1. We actually need to type the quotes too, because we're going to, otherwise we'll get it in the quotes, which is not what we want. So we're going to type the quotes here. So we're going to say player 1 plus quote wins exclamation point close quote. Then we're going to replace all. And the text cannot be found. What did I do wrong? Left the exclamation point off. So let's try this again. So player 1 wins exclamation point replace. So you see we replaced 8 occurrences. We're going to simply change 1 to 2 here. And we're going to change player 1 variable to the player 2 variable. And we'll run. So now if we run this program, we have John, we have Joe. We'll play one game. That doesn't do anything yet. So John wins game 1, John wins. And then no one wins game 2 over here, so we get the game as a draw. And then Joe wins game 2. So you see our player names now are here. Now we need to make some more changes, because remember we're going to track how many games they play and give a match total at the end. Returning to the top of our program, we need to create 2 more variables to hold how many games each player has won. So we're going to create X wins and O wins and set them both equal to 0. And we're going to come back down here to our win method, and we need to make some changes. We're going to get rid of the clear method. So we're going to highlight here all the X wins, and handy dandy find and replace, we're going to find clear, and we're going to replace it with X wins plus equal 1 semicolon. So we're going to actually find the clear semicolon too. So clear semicolon. And we're going to replace it with x wins plus equal 1. We can also say, and let's just do this, we can say, remember, in C# plus plus means plus equal 1. So we can say x wins plus plus. So we're going to replace all that. Now down here for the O's, but not the draw. We don't want to change the draw. We're going to change clear to O wins plus plus. Now for draw, we're simply right now going to get rid of the clear method. Now before we create the method calls, let's create the method we need. And we have one down here called GameManage. So let's create a method called GameManage, and then at the end of the method we're actually going to call the clear method to clear it out. We no longer need to call it each time because we're going to call GameManage here in just a moment. First thing we need to do in this is we need to increment our game counter. Now I know I haven't created it yet. I'm going to create it in just a minute. So game counter plus plus. So this is going to count how many games we've actually played. So we can actually create the game counter. We'll create it up at the top like everything else just to make it easier. So we're going to scroll all the way back up to the top here, and we're going to say int game counter equals 0. Alright, returning to the bottom here. And I'm sorry for all this scrolling. That should be the end of it. Alright, so we're going to increment our game counter. Now the first thing we need to know in this is, has the number of games matched the game counter? So if game counter equals games. Now remember, to do a comparison in C# for equality, we use the double equals. So if those two are equal, we're going to do something. We need a nested if here because we're going to do different things based on what happens. So we're going to say if x wins is greater than O wins, and we're going to get some, we won't get an error here because they're global variables, but this obviously won't work yet. So if x wins is greater than O wins, we're going to do something. Else if O wins is greater than x wins, we're going to do something. And then finally, if x wins equals O wins, we're going to do something. And I did not put this in parentheses, so I'm going to get an error, so let me fix that. Now I could have just said else, because if one's greater than the other, if one's not greater than the other, they have to be equal. But just for clarity's sake, I'm going to use an else if, which is fine. But I could just say else here, because it'd be the only possible condition that's left. Either they're equal or one's greater than the other. But we'll just use else if here. Now, what are we going to do? Well, if x is higher, we're going to say messagebox.show, and we're going to say player1, the name, we're going to call the variable which has the name, plus has won the match. Actually, let's do it this way. Has won the match plus x wins plus 2. Actually, let's say games 2 plus O wins plus, space, period. So player 1 has won the match, his wins, 2, O wins, and a period. Now I'm going to copy this, put it down here for O wins, change to player 2, and then change the order, because the winner's score is always going to go first. Now if they're the same, we'll copy and we'll say this game is a draw, each player won. Now, since they're the same, it doesn't matter which one I really choose. I can choose X wins or O wins, and I left a plus out here. That's why I have an error. Now, this all looks good, doesn't it? We have a problem. Remember, we can't use or make implicit comparisons in C#. We actually have to take all these integers and use to string. So there we go. Pause the video and add this code. Now I made it really small. There we go. Pause the video and add this code now. Alright, so now we have our message boxes in for each player winning. Now we need to actually call this method. But when we call it, we need to know the number of wins for each player for this method to work. So we're going to pass in X wins and O wins. And we're going to come up here to each of our win conditions and call game manage. And we're going to pass X wins and O wins. Then I'm going to simply copy and paste this into each one. So instead of calling the clear method, we're going to call this game manage method. And we even need to call it on the draw as well, because we still want to know if that happened to be the last game, we still want it to go to the end game procedure. Now, if it is not the end game procedure, we want this method to do some other things. So we're going to return over here to the design of form 1, and we're going to make it bigger. And we're going to put four labels, on the form. We'll call one X wins and one O wins. And then the other labels, we're just going to put a 0 in to start. And this is going to hold the current match counter. Now we can take all of these and make them bigger. We'll make them 28. Will that work? Yes. We'll align them with the top of the tic-tac-toe. Now we'll go in and name our two ones we're actually going to use in code. LBL X wins and LBLO wins. Now what we could actually do is actually change the name to the player. I'll let you do that as an extension. I'll just keep it X and O here for the sake of time, but you could easily change this to say whatever player 1's name is and whatever player's 2 name is. But we'll keep it X and O, and we have our two zeros here, so we have LBOX wins and LBOO wins. Now let's go back to our code. Now we're going to take LBL X wins dot text equals X wins to string. LBL O wins dot text equals O wins to string. So we're going to write out whatever the current total is of both. So we really don't need to know who won we don't really need it to know who won the last game. We're just keeping track overall. So let's check it out here. So we have John, we have Joe. We're going to play 2 games. So we'll say Joe wins game 1 here. Joe wins. Notice it goes to 1. The game resets because we called the clear method down here. And then we'll say John wins game 2. So we go 1-1. And we say the game is a draw. Each player's won 1 game. And then it clears. Now, after the match is over, we obviously want it to clear this out as well. Or do we? Maybe we want to keep it the same. Because we can keep playing again, right? We can keep playing again. But the problem here is Joe wins 2, but the game counter is above what the game says. So this will go on forever and ever. This will go on forever and ever because we're now checking this. Well, game counter is now greater than this, so it can never be equal to it again. So we need to make some adjustments. Once we get to this being equal, after we call these message boxes, we need to do something additional, which we'll do here in a second. Alright, so we've called the clear method at the end, which runs our method up here, which clears everything out and prepares us to move on. Now the first thing I want to do is after each of these conditions in the if, oops, I'm still running, in the if, not in one of these conditions, just in the if at the end, I want to clear out those labels. So LBL xwins.text equals 0, LBL owins.text equals 0. Now I'm going to get an error because it says integer, so I need to put the 0 in quotes in this case because I actually want it to be text. Or I could say 0.toString, but I'll just put it in text, which accomplishes the same thing. So now when the game counter equals the number of games, it'll reset that back to 0. Now you say, well, if you're going to close it, why would you want to do that? If they replay and it reopens the form, it won't reset the values. Whatever's there will stay there. So we're going to keep it. We'll reset it so that won't happen. Now, the next thing I want to do in this if is if any of these conditions happen, I actually want to hide the form. So this dot, let me take it back. The first thing I want to do is show the other form, and then hide this one. So now I just can't say names dot show. That won't work. See, I get an error. TTT names does not contain a definition. So I actually have to create it just like I did when I called form1. So form names equals new names. Then we're going to say names dot show. Then we're going to say this dot hide. So we're going to return them to the main screen. So we'll check this out. So we have John and Joe. We're going to play 2 games. We're going to start. So game 1 was a draw. Joe's going to win game 2 here. So Joe wins the match, 1 game to 0. And then we're going to return back to this. Now notice it did clear everything out because of the way we called it. So we're ready to play again. So John, Joe, 2. Let's try something. Let's check this out. Let's comment this out. And let's try something. So we're going to say John, Joe, 2. Alright, Joe wins. Game's a draw. Joe won 1 game to 0. And now it clears out. John, Joe, 2. Start. It does reset. So what I told you earlier wasn't exactly true, because we're using different forms. I just wanted to show you that we're using different forms, and this is why you don't need to do it, unlike you might have done in VB. So I'm going to close this out and get rid of these because we don't need it. It resets anyway. So here's our code to reset, and we're only going to run this obviously if these equal and after we run our condition of who won. And then we're going to run our clear method after we've incremented. If it's not the end of the game, we're going to run our clear method. Now, I want to do a couple more things here. I want to add 3 more buttons. Button 1 is going to be reset game. This will just reset the current game. So whatever the status of the current game is, we're going to reset it. So to do this, all we actually have to do is call the clear method. That's all we have to do. It's going to, and it'll reset, but it won't affect anything else. Now we want to say reset match. For this, we're going to keep the same number of games. We're just going to start over. So btn reset m. So for this, we need to do a little more. We need to call the clear method. We need to set x wins equal to 0, o wins equal to 0, and write out lbl o wins dot text equals 0 and lbl x wins dot text equals 0. So we're completely starting over. We're going to set the game counter back to 0 as well. So this is starting the match completely over. So we cleared out our current board state, and we've set everything, and our game counter is back to 0. So it will start over. This reset button here, just all it does is call the clear method, which resets the current game. None of these other values are affected. The last one is simply end match. And for this, we're going to actually need this same code right here. We're going to need it again. So why don't we put it in another method? So we're going to say private void end. And we're going to take this code, put it in this, and then here we'll just call the end method. And for this button, oops, put it in the wrong place, my bad. And then in the button, we'll call the end method. So now our tic-tac-toe game is complete. Test it out, see what you think. In our next lesson, we will look at classes more carefully, and some of the concepts you have seen here, like form and using the constructor all the way up here, using the constructor will be explained in more detail.